There is a moment, quiet and completely invisible from the outside, when someone who spent considerable time keeping you slightly unsure of your place in their life suddenly feels the ground shift beneath them, not because you did anything dramatic, not because you said anything cruel, but simply because you stopped needing them the way you once did. If you have ever wondered why withdrawing your need seems to produce a reaction considerably more intense than anything your pursuit ever managed to create, today we are going to walk through exactly why that happens, because the mechanism behind it reveals something genuinely important about avoidance psychology that most people never fully understand. Let's begin with a foundational truth worth stating plainly before going further. Avoidant relationships, despite their outward appearance of one person chasing and the other retreating, actually depend on a considerably more mutual dynamic than that simple description suggests. Your need, however painful it felt to carry, was quietly functioning as part of a system where their distance produced your pursuit, and your pursuit, in turn, produced a felt sense of security for them, evidence that despite their own inconsistency, someone remained committed enough to keep trying. When your need disappears, this entire system loses one of its two essential components. And systems built on two components rarely continue functioning smoothly once one of them stops participating as expected. Let's talk about what specifically happens internally once this disappearance becomes undeniable, because the internal experience deserves careful examination rather than remaining abstract. For as long as your need remained active, it functioned almost like background reassurance, present even during periods of their own withdrawal, offering an unconscious kind of security blanket that did not require their engagement in order to remain available. Once that need genuinely disappears, this background reassurance vanishes along with it, leaving considerable emotional space that previously stayed comfortably filled. This sudden absence does not simply register as neutral change. It often registers as significant loss, even though nothing about your actual behavior toward them has become hostile or punishing in any way. Let's talk about why this particular kind of loss triggers panic specifically, rather than simple sadness or simple adjustment, because panic implies something considerably more threatening than ordinary disappointment. Many avoidant individuals carry, often since early childhood, a deeply buried fear regarding their own fundamental lovability, a fear that closeness inevitably confirms rather than resolves. Your continued need, uncomfortable as it may have been for you to sustain, functioned as ongoing evidence against this fear, proof that despite their own inconsistency, despite their own difficulty with sustained closeness, someone still found them worth pursuing. When that evidence disappears, the fear it had been quietly holding at bay no longer has anything actively contradicting it. And this shift, occurring often below full conscious awareness, produces exactly the panic response this entire discussion has been describing. Let's talk about the specific timeline this panic typically follows, because understanding this timeline helps clarify why the reaction sometimes takes considerable time to become visible rather than arriving immediately the moment your need first begins to shift. Early on, the change in your behavior often gets minimized or rationalized, attributed to a temporary mood, a busy period, anything other than genuine, lasting transformation. This rationalization typically holds for a period, sometimes weeks, before repeated, consistent evidence eventually makes it impossible to sustain. Once this rationalization finally collapses, panic tends to arrive with somewhat sudden intensity, a delayed reaction to a change that had actually been developing gradually the entire time. Let's talk about what this panic specifically looks like once it becomes visible, because recognizing its particular texture helps distinguish it clearly from other, less significant reactions. This panic often manifests through sudden increased curiosity about your life, questions arriving with unusual frequency, attempts to re-establish the kind of closeness that had previously required no active effort on their part. It sometimes manifests through testing behavior, small provocations designed, consciously or not, to check whether the old anxious response can still be triggered despite the apparent shift. It occasionally manifests through genuine vulnerability, acknowledgement of patterns previously denied, offered with an urgency that reflects genuine internal disruption rather than calm, considered reflection. Let's talk about why this reaction so often surprises people who assumed their reduced need would simply produce reduced interest in return. Because this assumption, while intuitive, misunderstands the actual mechanism driving avoidant attachment. Avoidant partners are not typically drawn toward partners who need them intensely in any straightforward sense. They are drawn toward the specific feeling of being needed just enough to confirm their own worth, while remaining free enough to avoid the vulnerability that full reciprocal commitment would require. Removing your need entirely disrupts this delicate balance considerably more than simply reducing the intensity of pursuit would, because it removes the very confirmation their own psychological security had grown to depend upon. Let's talk about the specific role control plays throughout this entire dynamic, because control deserves careful examination given how significantly it shapes avoidant behavior more broadly. For as long as your need remained active, they retained considerable control over the relationship's pace, its terms, its overall emotional temperature, secure in the knowledge that your continued investment would remain available regardless of how they chose to engage with it. Your genuine release of need removes this control, not through any deliberate power play on your part, but simply through the natural consequence of your own healing and your own redirected attention. This loss of control, even when it develops through no manipulative intent whatsoever, often registers as deeply destabilizing, precisely because it was never consciously acknowledged as something they depended upon until its sudden absence made that dependence undeniable. Let's talk about what distinguishes genuine internal panic from simple confusion or simple mild disappointment. A distinction worth making because not every reaction to reduced need indicates the significant mechanism this discussion has been exploring throughout. Genuine panic typically produces disproportionate behavioral change, a considerably more significant shift in effort, in communication frequency, in vulnerability than the situation would otherwise seem to warrant from an outside perspective. Simple confusion or mild disappointment tends to produce more measured, more proportional adjustment, noticing the change without the same intensity of disrupted internal equilibrium. Let's talk about what this panic reveals, and equally importantly, what it does not reveal about the genuine health or genuine potential of the relationship moving forward. Panic reveals that your presence and your needs specifically carry genuine significance within their internal experience, information worth acknowledging, even amid everything else this discussion addresses. What panic does not reveal is whether genuine, sustainable transformation will follow from this disruption, or whether the panic simply produces temporary, crisis motivated effort that fades once your engagement has been sufficiently restored. These two possibilities require careful, patient distinction rather than assuming panic automatically indicates one or the other. Let's talk about how to distinguish these possibilities in practice, because this distinction matters enormously for how you choose to respond to whatever reaction eventually follows your own genuine shift. Sustainable transformation typically continues developing even once initial panic subsides, evidenced through consistency extended across weeks and months, rather than concentrated entirely within the acute crisis period immediately following your withdrawal. Temporary crisis reaction typically recedes once your engagement returns to previous levels, reverting back toward earlier patterns of inconsistency once the immediate threat of loss has been sufficiently soothed through renewed attention. Let's talk about the specific danger of immediately abandoning your own hard won internal stability the moment this panic produces encouraging signals. Danger worth naming directly, given how tempting this reversal often feels once genuine effort finally appears to be arriving. Rushing back into the same anxious, need driven dynamic the moment panic produces attention essentially recreates the exact system this entire discussion has been describing, where your engagement functions primarily as reassurance for their own security rather than as genuine reciprocal partnership. Maintaining your own continued stability, even while remaining genuinely open to whatever positive change might be developing, protects against this recreation of the earlier, more depleting pattern. Let's talk about what genuine self protection requires throughout this entire process, Protection that does not require becoming cold or dismissive toward whatever genuine internal struggle they might currently be experiencing. But that does require maintaining the internal work you have done to reach this place of authentic reduced need in the first place. This protection means continuing to invest in your own separate life, your own separate sources of meaning, regardless of how compellingly their panic might tempt you back into the earlier, more contingent dynamic. It means observing their response patiently over meaningful time rather than drawing immediate conclusions based purely on the initial intensity of their reaction. Let's talk about what it means to hold genuine compassion for the fear driving this panic, while still maintaining complete clarity regarding your own needs and your own reasonable boundaries moving forward. You can understand deeply why losing access to your need might trigger such significant internal disruption, tracing that disruption back to genuine, sympathetic origins in their own early formative experiences, while simultaneously recognizing that this understanding does not obligate you to return to a dynamic that ultimately depleted your own well-being considerably more than it ever honored it. Compassion and boundaries remain fully compatible throughout this entire process. Let's talk about what your own healing specifically requires once you have reached the place of genuine reduced need being described throughout this entire discussion. Your healing requires trusting that this shift developed for legitimate, healthy reasons, reflecting genuine growth rather than something requiring justification or apology, regardless of how significantly it disrupts someone else's previous sense of security. It requires releasing any residual guilt about the discomfort your own healing might be causing them, recognizing that their discomfort, however genuine, reflects their own internal architecture rather than any wrongdoing on your part for simply choosing to heal. Let's talk about what remains true regardless of which specific direction this relationship ultimately takes following this significant disruption. If genuine, sustained transformation follows, extending well beyond the initial panic into consistent, demonstrated change over meaningful time, this represents a real, hopeful possibility worth continuing to observe carefully rather than immediately trusting completely. If the panic simply produces temporary reaction that fades once your engagement returns, this too represents valuable, clarifying information, confirming that the relationship's previous foundation depended considerably more on your anxious pursuit than on any genuine, reciprocal partnership capable of sustaining itself once that pursuit authentically disappeared. Let's talk about the specific physiological signature of this panic when it becomes visible, because noticing these physical cues, when observable, offers additional confirmation of the internal mechanism this entire discussion has been describing. This might include noticeably faster response times after a period of typical delay, communication arriving with a kind of urgency detectable even through text alone, phrasing that carries more immediacy than their usual, more measured tone. It might include physical restlessness during in-person interaction, difficulty maintaining the composed distance that previously characterized their typical presentation. These physical signals, while never conclusive on their own, often provide useful supplementary information alongside the more obvious behavioral shifts already discussed throughout this conversation. Let's talk about what specifically happens to their own internal narrative during this panic period, narrative worth understanding even though it remains largely inaccessible from the outside. Many avoidant individuals report, upon later reflection, a considerable internal scramble during this period, attempting to understand what changed, searching for explanation that does not require confronting the more vulnerable truth that their own security had been depending on your continued need all along. This scramble often produces exactly the kind of external inconsistency partners find so confusing, alternating between renewed warmth and sudden defensive distance, reflecting genuine internal conflict rather than calculated strategy. Let's talk about the specific way mutual friends or shared social circles sometimes become unwitting witnesses to this internal disruption, providing indirect confirmation of what is happening even without direct communication reaching you. Comments about seeming distracted, seeming unusually preoccupied, occasional mentions of your name arising more frequently than previous patterns would suggest, all represent potential indirect evidence that the panic being described throughout this discussion has genuinely taken hold. This indirect evidence deserves the same measured interpretation applied throughout every other aspect of this analysis, useful as an additional data point, but never sufficient on its own to draw firm conclusions. Let's talk about what happens specifically if this panic never produces any visible external response at all, a possibility deserving honest acknowledgement rather than assuming panic always translates into observable behavioral change. Some avoidant individuals, particularly those whose defenses remain especially entrenched, manage to suppress even significant internal disruption almost entirely, maintaining outward composure despite considerable internal turmoil occurring beneath the surface. This possibility means the absence of visible panic does not definitively confirm the absence of genuine internal impact, though it does provide meaningfully different information than visible panic would offer regarding their current capacity for expressed vulnerability. Let's talk about what this uncertainty means for your own decision making moving forward. Given that visible confirmation may never arrive regardless of what internal process actually unfolds on their end, your own path forward should never depend entirely on obtaining this kind of external confirmation, whether visible panic appears, whether it remains entirely hidden, or whether it appears and then simply fades without producing lasting change. Your own healing and your own continued life require the same fundamental approach. Continued investment in your own well-being independent of whatever remains unknown or unconfirmed about their specific internal experience. Let's talk about the specific temptation to seek out this confirmation actively, monitoring for evidence of their panic through indirect channels, checking for signs that your absence has produced the internal disruption this discussion has described. This temptation deserves gentle but firm redirection because active monitoring for their reaction, even when framed as simply seeking validation for your own healing, risks recreating exactly the anxious attention this entire process was meant to help you release. Genuine healing requires releasing the need for this confirmation just as thoroughly as it requires releasing the need for their consistent presence. Let's talk about how this entire mechanism connects to a broader psychological principle worth understanding clearly. The concept, sometimes called the extinction burst, a phenomenon observed across behavioral psychology, where previously reliable behavior, upon suddenly stopping producing its expected reward, temporarily intensifies before eventually fading entirely. Applied here, this means their initial reaction to your reduced need may actually represent an intensified version of their usual patterns. Increased effort at reasserting control over a dynamic that has stopped functioning predictably, rather than representing a completely new, transformed behavior emerging for the first time. Understanding this concept helps explain why initial reactions sometimes feel considerably more intense than anything witnessed throughout the relationship's earlier history, without that intensity necessarily indicating lasting transformation. Let's talk about what typically happens after this extinction burst period passes, assuming genuine, sustained transformation does not develop to replace it. Behavior patterns, once the intensified reaction fails to restore the previous predictable system, tend to gradually fade, sometimes reverting toward even greater distance than existed previously, as the underlying defensive architecture essentially gives up attempting to restore what has become genuinely unavailable. This potential trajectory deserves honest acknowledgement, protecting against assuming the initial intense reaction necessarily predicts continued escalating effort indefinitely. Let's talk about what distinguishes a relationship capable of moving through this extinction burst period toward genuine, transformed partnership from one that simply proceeds toward this eventual fading and eventual greater distance. This distinction typically depends on factors extending well beyond simply the intensity of the initial panic, factors including their own genuine willingness to engage in deliberate internal work, their own access to therapeutic or other structured support, and the broader context of whatever life circumstances currently surround them, all factors that exist largely outside your own influence or control, regardless of how patiently or how skillfully you navigate your own side of this dynamic. Let's talk about what it means to release attachment to predicting which specific trajectory this relationship will ultimately follow, Releasing the need to know in advance whether genuine transformation or eventual fading represents the more likely outcome. This release does not mean abandoning hope entirely, but it does mean holding that hope considerably more loosely than the anxious, desperate hope that likely characterized earlier stages of this relationship, allowing whatever genuine trajectory eventually reveals itself through patient, sustained observation rather than through premature prediction based on initial, potentially misleading intensity. Let's talk about what specific self care deserves particular attention during this period of uncertain observation, given how emotionally demanding it genuinely proves to witness someone else's visible panic without immediately rushing to soothe it through renewed anxious engagement. Continued connection with supportive friends who understand your situation, continued engagement with activities providing genuine satisfaction independent of this relationship, and continued honest reflection, whether through journaling or through trusted conversation, regarding your own internal experience throughout this observation period, all support your own stability, regardless of which specific trajectory the relationship ultimately follows. Let's talk about what it means to trust your own judgment throughout this entire process. Judgment that has already demonstrated considerable growth simply through reaching the point of authentic reduced need this discussion has been exploring throughout. You do not require external validation, whether from them or from anyone else, in order to trust that your own healing represents genuine progress worth protecting, regardless of whatever reaction it produces or fails to produce on their end. This trust in your own judgment, developed through the very process of reaching this point, becomes a permanent resource available to you throughout every future circumstance requiring similar discernment. Let's talk about the specific way this entire experience, navigated with patience and genuine self respect, rather than anxious monitoring or premature conclusion, ultimately serves your capacity for future relationships, extending well beyond this single situation. Having witnessed directly how avoidant panic operates, how it can reflect either genuine internal disruption, motivating lasting change, or simply temporary reaction to lost predictability, you carry forward considerably sharper discernment for recognizing similar patterns in any future relationship involving comparable dynamics. Discernment that protects you from repeating confusion you have now worked hard to understand clearly. Let's talk about what it means to remain genuinely open to reconciliation. Should this relationship eventually reveal sustained, genuine transformation rather than temporary reaction, without allowing that openness to compromise the internal stability you have worked so hard to establish? This openness looks considerably different from the anxious hope that likely characterized earlier stages of this connection. It involves observing evidence patiently, requiring sustained consistency extended across meaningful time before genuinely trusting that change has occurred, while remaining willing to engage authentically should that evidence eventually genuinely accumulate. Let's talk about what specific conversation, should you eventually choose to engage in one, might help clarify whether genuine transformation has actually taken root. This conversation benefits from focusing on specific, observable behavior rather than abstract reassurance. Asking directly what has changed in their own understanding of themselves, what specific steps they have taken toward addressing the patterns that originally created this dynamic, rather than accepting vague promises or general statements of renewed commitment without concrete substance behind them. Let's talk about what happens to your own capacity for trust throughout this entire process. Trust that deserves careful, gradual rebuilding, rather than either complete restoration based on initial promising signals or permanent, rigid withholding, regardless of whatever genuine evidence eventually develops. Gradual trust rebuilding involves extending slightly increased engagement in response to slightly increased demonstrated consistency, allowing the relationship's trajectory to reveal itself incrementally, rather than through any single dramatic decision made prematurely in either direction. Let's talk about what it means to hold your own worth as entirely separate from whatever outcome this particular relationship ultimately produces. Worth that remains completely intact, whether this connection eventually develops into genuine, sustainable partnership, or whether it simply confirms, through continued inconsistency, that it was never capable of providing what genuine partnership actually requires. Your worth was never determined by their capacity to develop genuine security in response to your own healing, and holding this truth firmly protects you from tying your own self perception to an outcome that remains, ultimately, outside your complete control. Let's talk finally about what genuine freedom looks like once this entire understanding has been fully absorbed. Freedom that comes from no longer needing to control or predict exactly how someone else responds to your own healthy, hard won growth. This freedom allows you to continue building your own life fully, regardless of whether panic produces genuine transformation, temporary reaction, or nothing observable whatsoever. Trusting that your own path forward remains valuable and worth pursuing entirely on its own terms, independent of any single relationship's ultimate resolution. Let's talk about what it means to recognize your own growth as the central achievement of this entire experience, regardless of everything discussed regarding their possible panic and its uncertain trajectory. You did not simply survive a confusing, inconsistent dynamic. You developed genuine internal stability, significant enough to disrupt patterns that had likely persisted in various forms throughout much of their own adult relational history. This achievement belongs entirely to you, built through considerable effort and considerable patience, and it remains permanently yours, regardless of whatever happens next within this specific situation. Let's talk about what it means to celebrate this growth openly, at least within your own private reflection, rather than minimizing it simply because the relationship's ultimate outcome remains genuinely uncertain. Reaching authentic reduced need, genuine internal stability, no longer contingent on someone else's inconsistent behavior, represents a significant psychological accomplishment, deserving genuine recognition. An accomplishment that many people navigating similarly difficult relationships never manage to reach at all, remaining instead trapped indefinitely within anxious pursuit that never resolves into the clarity and the peace you have now genuinely achieved. Let's talk about what remains available to you moving forward, carrying this understanding into whatever comes next, whether that involves continued patient observation of this specific relationship, eventual departure toward a connection genuinely capable of matching your own growth, or simply continued investment in your own life, regardless of how this particular situation eventually resolves. What remains available is a version of yourself considerably more grounded, considerably more self aware, and considerably more capable of genuine partnership than the version that existed before this entire difficult, clarifying journey began. Carry that version forward with confidence, trusting that whatever comes next will simply be met by someone who has already proven, through direct experience, that genuine healing was possible all along. And so, if you have recently noticed someone reacting with unexpected intensity to your own genuine, hard won release of need, understand clearly what this reaction most likely represents. It is not necessarily proof of transformed capacity for genuine intimacy, nor is it proof that they never cared throughout the relationship's entire history. It is evidence that your presence and the need you once carried held genuine significance within a system that depended considerably more on your participation than either of you may have consciously realized until it stopped. Trust your own healing fully. Whatever they choose to do with the space your release has created belongs entirely to them to navigate, while your own continued peace remains something you have already, rightfully, claimed as your own.